And once again, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Alan Presland. I'm CEO at Parenta and also the author of the book, Improving the Business of Childcare. This is the 10th webinar we've been running in our series for the sector over the last 11 months, which is a bit weird, but never mind. We didn't do one over Christmas. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. A little bit of a different format than we've been doing over the last year or so. Today, we're going to ask everybody to stay on mute and we are not asking for questions in the way that we normally do. We have asked for questions in advance for our colleagues at Ofsted and we've received a massive number of questions for them. Please forgive us if we haven't been able to answer every single question or ask every single question that you may have raised over this period. But what we have tried to do is consolidate as many of them as we can and to put them into a format which I think is appropriate for this type of presentation. Obviously, it's an absolute pleasure for us to have two outstanding members from Ofsted with us today. Firstly, I'd like to introduce to you Wendy Ratcliffe. Wendy is one of Her Majesty's inspectors, a qualified early years practitioner. She has extensive experience of inspection and regulation across a full range of early years provisions, including schools. And her role as Principal Officer for Early Years in Ofsted's Education Policy Team is focused on the inspection of early years education curriculum, including the new EIF, and of course, any additional changes that might occur. Also today, we have Phil Minns. Phil is a Specialist Advisor for Early Years and Primary. Phil trained as an early years specialist and started teaching reception in Birmingham. He was a head teacher for 14 years, leading schools out of special measures and developing schools to become outstanding. Phil was awarded National Leader of Education status and first became one of Her Majesty's Schools inspectors following a year-long secondment to Ofsted. Phil has also been an Assistant Director of Children's Services and the CEO of a multi-academy. While working in the local authority, Phil had oversight of early years, school improvement and provision for pupils who have SEN or disabilities. And so, as I said, we've got a load of questions ready for Wendy and Phil today. And firstly, let me welcome you both. And secondly, thank you enormously for your time. We really do appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody in our community appreciates both of you giving up your time for us all today. So with that, I'm going to just start, if I may. And so the first question that's come in, or the first two questions really, are really around matters, birth to 5 matters. And the first one is, how will the new guidance affect the way that, that we track children's progress in the setting?
Okay, I think, Phil, are you going to take a stab at that first one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting with both. I mean, I think the Development Matters document is the DfE's non-statutory guidance, and then other things, you know, like the birth to 5 matters are other things that are available, and I'm sure there are other things available as well, and some places will have their own approach and will have sort of done that breakdown already. We don't have a preferred method of how places monitor the progress that children make. So it's really up to you as a setting or a provider to decide the way that that works best for you, and we're not going to be inspecting it. What we're interested in is, you know, what you know about that child, what they used to be able to do, what they're learning to do now, and where you want them to get by the time they leave you or move on to the next room or the next place. You know, we know that you will want to have a way of recording that, particularly if you're working in a larger group where you've got to communicate with other people. But that's not something that we are going to inspect. The way that we'll understand what you know about your children is often through the conversations that we have with you, where we're saying, you know, talk to us about Noah over there. What's he doing? What could he do when he started with you? What are you working on at the moment? And where do you want him to get to by the end? We're interested in that journey. We might be asking you, you know, if you are, you know, the assessment or whatever that you're doing, what you're doing with that information. You know, how are you using what you've found out about that child to help them get where you want them to be? But we're not, we don't have a sort of pre-prescribed approach that we would expect to see.
Okay, that's great. Wendy, anything to add on that one?
No, absolutely. Just to echo what Phil says, I mean, we're really interested in what it's like to be a child at your setting, and actually, we want to find out how what it's like by observation, by discussion. So thinking about how you make sure children get to where they need to be and ready for their next stage is entirely up to you, and how you monitor that and check children are progressing. Again, as Phil says, entirely up to you how you do that. No prescribed way from us.
Okay.
And often, Alan, sorry, the way that we'll be, rather than looking at your tracking document, for example, as a thing on its own, what we're interested in is actually how what you do works for the children. So we'll be looking at it from the child's point of view rather than like some sort of system approach.
It's a bit like I sometimes think that I don't think anyone went into childcare to fill in coloured boxes on a Excel spreadsheet. Actually, people went into childcare to make sure that children get off to a good start.
I'm sure, Wendy, everybody will agree with that point. Absolutely. Thank you very much, both of you, for that one. Second question then, same subject matter. The question is, how will we be able to show the progress of a child who's previously been tracked using the old development matters when we're moving to the new guidance, because they're so fundamentally different?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really interesting question. And I think, Phil, maybe we could just touch on what actually the difference between curriculum and assessment there in responding to that question.
Yeah, I mean, when we inspect against the requirements that are laid out in the EYFS. So what we're looking for are those, to see the extent to which those things are met. And the curriculum is laid out in that EYFS in the areas for learning, those brief sections which outline, what children will be learning under communication and language, numeracy, PSED, all of those areas. And that's what we'll be inspecting to see that the curriculum that you offer, that the learning that you offer covers all of those areas. When we're looking at how progress, the progress that children achieve, it's very much what we were saying before. It's through those conversations. It's first of all, we want to understand where you want your children to get to by the time they move on from you. What are the really important things in each of those areas of learning that you want them to get? And then, where are they on that journey? How are you, how do you know that they're going to get there? If you're worried they're not going to get there, what are you doing about that? How are you helping them to learn the stuff that they need to learn by the time they move on? What do you think, Wendy? Is that what else?
Yeah, no, and I was just thinking, in terms of what we know is when we were developing our education inspection framework ahead of September 2019, one of the things that we were really mindful of was around that whole assessment of young children, and actually that whole industry that's developed, and whether that's kind of checklists, online systems, whatever that might be, but actually knowing that assessment of young children was taking adults away from the important interactions with children, which we know makes all the difference. So very much thinking about, it's reflecting on what your assessment does, and is it doing the right thing for children?
Yeah, and the best assessment is what you do with a child, isn't it? It's when you know the child really well, and you know what you want them to learn, and you're trying to bring those things together. So you're trying to find the best way to help that child learn the thing that you want them to learn. And that sort of assessment is actually it's going on in your brain. And that's the most powerful bit, because it's happening when you're actually working with that child and you're helping them to learn something. If the assessment is actually about wandering around and waiting to be able to tick a box, then the children aren't really benefiting from that in the same way. And so, I mean, sometimes you do need to, I suppose, wander around and tick a box, perhaps. But actually, if you're going to, you've got to know that what you're doing is really valuable, and more valuable than actually that direct work you will have with the child. Because we know, like Wendy said, that children learn most when they've got your attention, don't they? That's when they really benefit. That interaction with an adult who knows them well and knows what you want them to learn. And that's the really powerful thing. So we would always be urging you to think about, you know, the way that you're doing those assessments, and if it's taking you on away from working with children directly, we'd just be wanting you to make sure that that children don't lose out because of that, I suppose.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So unsurprisingly, I think the topics are going to turn to inspections themselves. And so the first question is the one I suspect both of you you're ready for and waiting for. But the first one is, you know, when inspections start again, how will they work in practice?
Okay, so if I start, Phil, then you can just chip in with anything that I miss off. So already referred to the fact that we introduced a new inspection framework, the Education Inspection Framework, back in September 2019. And very much I think we'd done almost 2 terms of that inspection framework, not quite, when our inspections were suspended. But we are now back to EIF inspection, so that Education Inspection Framework. And in order to make sure that we've had a safe and phased return, we've done some field work to make sure that that methodology, the way in which we gather our evidence on an inspection, is safe to do so, and we can do that within the COVID context. So we are now back to full EIF graded inspections from the 4th of May, it was. And actually what we've done with our handbook is we've updated it, that has got an additional section in there that gives a bit of a COVID context. So it just explains the slight differences that there are in terms of the notification call, where we talk about inspection safety. But essentially, there are no changes to our EIF methodology, the way in which we gather our evidence through the observations and the interactions and those discussions that we have with you while on inspection. Phil, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, Wendy mentioned the notification call, and if you look at the handbook, and everything that we do on inspection is in that handbook. There's nothing that we sort of keep secret from that.
There's no secret. Secret thing out there. Yeah,
if you want to know what we'll do, read the handbook, because it's all in there, and it's what our inspectors use all the time as well. We've allowed, because of COVID, we've allowed for a longer notification call. And the reason for that is because we know we've got to spend longer talking to you about the arrangements that you've made, sometimes the way that COVID has affected you. We might want to try and organise things a little bit more than we would have done previously, just so that things can work smoothly, and so that we understand, you know, the way that you're working because of COVID, and also so that we can fit in with that. So there's that option for a longer phone call. The inspection process itself is always really focused on what it's like to be a child in this place, and that's what we're interested in. We want to know, and so we are interested in, you know, how COVID has affected you and the children. We're also interested in, you know, if there are things that you've noticed, you know, the children have come back in and there are things that they couldn't do that they could do before. We'll be interested to know how you're helping them sort of catch up with that, and how you're getting them back to where you want them to be. We're not so interested in paperwork. We're much more interested in actually what's happening for those children on a day-to-day basis.
I'm really, really keen to make sure that no child gets left behind.
Yeah, so we're sort of more interested, I suppose, now in those children who you're more worried about, in a way, you know, the ones who you are thinking, oh, you know, that they might have been more negatively affected by their experiences of COVID.
Okay, good, thank you. So for everybody else's benefit, if you haven't got a copy of the handbook, we'll include that with the copy of the recording after the call, so it will come out this afternoon. And thank you both, but you also answered the next question, which was when do specific graded inspections commence again? And you said 4th of May, so 10 days ago, everybody. That means we're in it. So the next question is really going back to the return of inspections, and you Ofsted have formally given announcement there's 4 categories of providers who will be prioritised. will you be working through in the order of those priorities? So it was, I think it was first was those who require improvement or unsatisfactory, or is there another sort of set criteria that you'll use for sequencing what's going forward?
No, I think one of the things that people may be aware of, that it was back in the autumn term, we announced a change to how we organise our inspections in terms of scheduling them, moving from an inspection cycle. There was we were working prior to the pandemic, we were working in an inspection cycle, which meant that cycle was for a cycle of 4 years, and everybody would need to be inspected within that 4-year cycle. And we've actually moved now to a window, an inspection window, which actually we feel is a much better approach, because actually that's each individual inspection, each individual provider will have a 6-year window in which we will come and inspect, and that will be 6 years depending on when their last inspection was. Now, within that, though, of course, as you say, Alan, there are some priorities. We prioritise inspection based on a number of things, and we have set that out in the handbook in terms of, you know, those priorities for when we return to inspection. But essentially, we use those to that information to decide where we need to focus our attention first, really. And it will be based on the length of time since we were last at that provider, and actually what we know about that provider. So in essence, it's really quite difficult to answer kind of quite specific questions around when will I have my next inspection. I'm sitting on this grade, but actually I was last seen then, because actually it's you know, we base it on when your last inspection was and what we know about a provider. I don't know if that helps. Phil, was there anything to add to that?
No, I think it
probably wasn't clear, but
I mean, like, you know, as Wendy said, that we've got the criteria. If you fulfill those criteria, you might think that your inspection is going to come more quickly than if you don't fulfill the criteria. But we don't, obviously, we don't sort of publish lists of when we're coming.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Good. All right, thank you. So next question's then really about the key carer, and the key carer clearly has a child development folder with all the children's information. Do Ofsted generally want to look at that folder and look at the observations therein, or are they more interested in simply asking the staff questions about the individual child's development needs?
Okay, so I can start with that one. So I think there's kind of, you've got two things in that question, haven't you? That saying that, you know, the key person will have a child development folder with children's information in, and do we want to look at observations, or do we simply want to ask questions? And I think, again, as Phil says, it's really helpful to look at our inspection handbook, because actually that will outline what it is that we do on an inspection and how we go about gathering and recording our evidence. So I think essentially when we're thinking about the progress that a child makes, and if we're talking to a key person about an individual child that we want to track the experiences of, for example, then we're wanting that key person to talk to us about that child. Tell us what, I think you used Noah before, Phil. Tell us what Noah could do when he arrived with you. What are you working on now? What can he do now? And where are you getting Noah to, so that he's ready for what comes next? So it's more about us looking at the evidence of learning that's happening, so observing children and practitioners and having those conversations to find out the story for that individual child.
Yeah, it really, I mean, it comes back to what we're interested in is how well you know them. You know, and so it's not so much what's on a piece of paper somewhere. It's actually, you know, what are they doing? What do they like? How are you helping them to make the steps forward that you need to make? So it's not so much about how you're choosing to record that information or where it sits. I mean, and when we're on inspection, we won't look at sort of tracking data and things like that people might be keeping. But what we are interested in is what any assessment or tracking that you've been doing tells you about them, and how that helps you to let them learn more. You know, it's what difference is it making to that child?
Great, perfect, okay. I've got one last question on inspections, and forgive me, I'm reading from a list, and I realised you sort of answered it, but I'm gonna take us back to that specific point, because I think it's important that we get a bit more clarity if we can. And certainly people will be nervous. But there's a question here which is really specific, and it says the setting was judged inadequate in early 2020, and then had an interim visit at the end of 2020. And they're obviously a little bit nervous about when they may get re-inspected. So Wendy, you did really answer that, but is there any more light you can shed on that at all, do you think?
I think one of the things that, you know, we've obviously continued with some of our important activity, because we are a regulator as well as an inspector. So we've continued with some of our regulatory work through the pandemic, and that question refers to interim visits. So we did go to providers who were judged as inadequate as part of, you know, over the last year or so, just to check that they'd followed up on things following their last inspection. And I think what's really important to say is, you know, as we've returned to EIF and we've republished our handbooks, we've actually outlined those providers that we will prioritise for inspection. And that does include those judged less than good at their last inspection, including those who received an interim visit back in the autumn term. So that provider will be in our pot of people that we will prioritise, because they, as Phil says, they tick those priorities.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, a really generic one then next, please. And this one is really about what advice can you give to new managers who are nervous about first inspections. But I think I'm going to extend that and actually say not only new managers, but we all know staff get so nervous when you're in front of them. Any advice that for them and for managers in that instance?
Is it easy for us to say don't be nervous?
Yeah. No.
I mean, but that's what we would want to say. We would want to say, please don't be. I think what's really important, we know that inspection can be nerve-wracking, but ultimately, as Phil mentioned earlier, you know, as inspectors, we're charged with finding out what it's like to be a child in this place. And our advice would be carry on as you would usually. Don't do anything different just because an inspector calls.
Yeah, I think people.
I know that's easy to say, isn't it, Phil? But yeah,
it is. It's you know, success in inspection isn't about performance. It's not about doing something on the day that we're in, which is better or brighter or sharper or funnier or anything than what you do usually. If you want to, you know, be a good or outstanding provider, that's about what you do every single day. It's about what you do for the children. And when we come in, we'll see that. And that's what we're interested in. When Wendy says we're interested in what's like to be a child in this place, it's not about being a child in this place on the day that we're there. What we want to understand is actually what it's like to be a child in this place every day. Because it's no good if it's only good on the day that we're there. And partly we'll see that because the children won't know the stuff that you want them to know and won't behave in the way that you want them to behave. So that's really what we're looking for. And that's all of the conversations we'll have with you will be about what's it like here? What's it like to be a child here all the time?
And actually, it's an opportunity to showcase as well what you do well. Is, you know, what is it that you're proud of? What are you working on that you know is going really well? And what are you focusing your attention on in terms of what else you're wanting to do to improve?
And don't be afraid of telling us about the things that you want to be better, because that's actually a good sign for us. If there are things that you're thinking, you know, those bits I'm really pleased with, but these bits are ones that I really want to be better, that shows us that you've got a good overview of what's going on and that you want everything to improve. Because to be honest, even if you're outstanding, there are still things that people want to be better.
And that's partly a feature of being outstanding, is knowing actually that actually you know, this is what we do really well and this is what we're continuing to work on.
And when we talk about being good or outstanding, what we mean is that the children in your place are getting a good or outstanding experience. So actually it all comes down to the children. It's not about having the right stuff on the walls or having the right, you know, having bought the right furniture. It is about what those children get on a day-to-day basis.
Going back to what is it like to be a child in this setting?
Yeah.
And again, you know, all of those, yeah, everything's set out in our handbook. And again, go back to the handbook, read it, and see, yeah, see what it is that we're wanting to do while we're with you.
Okay, good, thank you. The one piece of advice I took out of that, which I thought was really telling, and that's about making sure that all providers are explaining back to you what they want to do better. I think that's something that often people are almost embarrassed if they're not at the right end of things. And so I think that's an amazing piece of advice. Thank you. All right, so inevitably we're going to start talking about COVID, because, you know, we don't have enough of that in our daily lives. So do you have any sort of generic thoughts on COVID and how you deal with inspections generically, before I ask any specific questions? I know I'm not supposed to go off topic, but it's generic about how you guys are dealing with things from COVID, or as we come out of COVID, shall we say?
Yeah, as we're on that roadmap, aren't we? And we are on that roadmap, and things are improving all the time, and things are changing. I just think one of the things that people might be interested in is that we did some research, some telephone calls during COVID to hear from providers what was affecting them and the children. And we've published those in a series of 3 short briefings. And people might just find those helpful in terms of what that, you know, what I think we made around 730 odd calls to early years providers, including childminders, and also to some maintained nursery schools. And just, you know, it was just interesting to hear how COVID was affecting people. In terms of us being ready to return to inspection, we keep up to, we've got, you know, we follow the 3 principles basically, that we will always follow the most up-to-date guidance. We're sensitive to the issues that COVID present, and, you know, it's a priority that we make sure that everybody remains safe through our inspection and regulatory work. Phil, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I was just going to go back to those phone calls that Wendy was telling you about. And what we found really interesting was the conversations we were having with people where they were saying to us, where they were explaining what they couldn't do, you know, so the equipment they couldn't use or the places they couldn't visit. But then were telling us so how they were trying to make up for that for the children. You know, we had a childminder who explained that actually what they did usually was they used to go to the park a lot, and they used to go out and do they had a group of people that they went out with, and that their children would have a lot of sort of climbing and stuff. And one childminder I remember saying to me, so I got my husband to put some things in the garden and we made an obstacle course. So we couldn't go out and do the stuff, but we were still trying to get the children to have the same access to the learning. Somebody else I remember telling us about not being able to do Play-Doh, and so they'd come up with some other things they could do where they'd really thought about, well, why do I need Play-Doh? What do the children actually learn by using the Play-Doh? And then if I can't use Play-Doh, how can I give them something else to do? And so we thought there was some really interesting thinking going on, where people were really thinking about, so what have my children not had the opportunity to learn? And if I can't, for example, do Play-Doh, what can I do instead? So we thought there was a lot of resourceful thinking going on there. And equally, there were people who were saying that children, when they came back to them, you know, those children who had forgotten some things, you know, forgotten how to go to the loo on their own, or forgotten, you know, some of the routines. And what people were saying to us then, which we also thought was really sensible, was that I'm helping them to remember. So it's not that they can't do this anymore, but because they haven't been with me or in our setting, they've forgotten some of the things. And I've just got to give them time to remember how to do it. And they were really focusing on that rather than thinking, well, you know, this is something that's gone. Like, and someone was saying to us, I can't remember what the example they gave, but it was something, you know, as an adult, we might not have done something for a long time. You know, you might not have ridden a bike for a long time, but if you give yourself a chance to remember, you remember, and then you're okay. And I thought it was quite good that they were talking in that way and recognizing that the children hadn't, this learning wasn't lost. Those children just needed help to remember to get back to where they were.
Great, thank you. You mentioned there, Wendy, the links to the notes, and we will send them out after this call with the recording. So thank you for reminding everybody about them. We found the links already, and they'll be coming out. So cool. The next two questions you've sort of answered, but I'm going to ask them anyway. So the first one was, will Ofsted negatively judge settings for a stripped back COVID-safe provision? So we're talking about soft furnishings, dressing up clothes, pillow and cozy spaces being removed. And you've sort of answered that. I don't know if you want to add any more colour to it.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we have potentially, Phil's given a couple of examples there, I think, as well. So, and I think it's where, providers have told us in that research how they've had to think of new ways of developing children's skills. And for some, actually, it's thinking about how they implement their curriculum, i.e. what is it that we want our children to learn? And some providers said that they'd increase the amount of adult-led activities due to the number of resources and activities on offer. But I think it's important here that, we know that landscape continues to change. We know DfE will continuing to update the guidance for early years providers. And I think there was another iteration of that. I don't know if that was the beginning of this week or was it the beginning of last week, but there was another update. And I know they continue to do that as we're on this roadmap. But actually, ultimately, on inspection, we won't negatively judge settings for stripping back COVID safe provision. Actually, it goes back to some of those things we've already been saying. We're interested to find out how you decide what it is that you want your children to learn and how you then go about providing that for your children. What resources do you provide? And how, if you can't provide certain resources, how are you then thinking differently about that? And ultimately, what impact does that have on children's learning?
Right. And the resources, I mean, we know that some aspects of learning have been affected by, the rules around COVID, but it's a bit like, I don't know, if you give your children fruit every day because you want them to be healthy and you always give them apples, but then there are no apples, well, you start giving them bananas, don't you? So you think, I still want them to have the fruit, but how can I give it differently? Rather than saying, okay, well, there's no fruit now. And it's that with the learning sometimes as well. It's remembering that the activities, in effect, aren't really the important thing. The important thing is what children learn from that activity. The conversations they have with you, the physical activities that they complete. What's important there is because they're learning stuff all the time. So if you can't do one thing, and I've mentioned Play-Doh already, that doesn't really mean that children can't still learn things about language, about the touch and the feel. They can't learn fine motor skills. There's all sorts of things. Just because they can't do that one thing, they'll get it somewhere else. It's just about thinking a bit more creatively sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I love your apples and bananas analogy, but it makes it so clear, doesn't it, when you put it that way, and particularly when people are nervous about having had stuff taken away. The next question, which you've answered it, or an answer, is exactly that. Play materials were taken away. How would you judge it? I think you've answered it clearly. So I'm going to move on from the horrible subject of COVID, because we're all bored of it, aren't we, after a year and a bit? And if I may talk about the new framework. So the first question here is, how will the new statutory framework affect wraparound care, and will they be considering the need to re-inspect?
Okay, so I think we just need to clarify here, because I'm making an assumption there, Alan, that we're talking about DfE's, the changes to the early years foundation stage statutory framework.
Correct.
Yeah, so which come into play in September this year. So in terms of thinking about from our perspective and how that would affect wraparound care in terms of inspection, in our, I think it's important to remind everybody that what we do is we inspect in line with the principles and requirements of the EYFS, and that won't change. And we've got in our published handbook a section at the back. It's an Annex A, it's called, and that's how we inspect those providers who basically offer wraparound care. So they're on the early years register because they've got early years children, but actually they provide care before and after the school day and during school holidays. That's set out in the annex in our handbook, and very much around, those providers don't have to meet the learning and development requirements of the EYFS. That won't change, and we'll continue to inspect them in the way that we do. We're interested to find out how settings, complement, I guess, what's happened in the school day, how they plan, what children are going to do while they're with them. Whether that's, recognising that some children just need to have a rest, or they need a snack to refuel, or whatever it might be, and then how they make sure that there's a range of opportunities and activities available for children after school.
Phil, anything to add to that?
No, just to reiterate that point that Wendy made there, that often, the important thing for those children when they just had a tiring day at school is that they do have a snack and a rest. Sitting down in front of the telly for a bit is a valid activity for them to be doing if what they've been doing all day is working hard in a school or somewhere else. Okay,
so that brings me nicely to the next question, which again is about wraparound care. And the question is there anything specific that you would be looking at in that scenario? Obviously, you've mentioned, a snack and a rest is important, but is there anything, that you would look for out of the ordinary, or anything specific?
I think, what we actually do on those inspections again is, wanting to find out what it's like to be a child here. What's it like to be a child here after you've had a day in school? How are children involved in the setting of planning for what happens while they're in settings? And just, it's set out in our handbook, but again, it's very much, answering that question, what is it like to be a child here?
I think reading for our youngest children is really, really important. And so we're always interested to see the extent to which those providers are supporting those children and understand where those children are with their reading, and understanding perhaps the way that they can help the child if that's part of what's going on. If that child has reading to do every night and they're doing it in that place rather than at home, or if they've got an expectation on sort of that bit of homework, then the extent to which people understand how that's working so they can support the child.
So, inspectors on that type of inspection will still want to be observing those important interactions between adults and children, having conversations about how they create and plan the play environment, how they seek children's views and engage them in that planning, as well as, all those things around safeguarding and welfare as well, which happen on inspection too.
Lovely. Okay. So just finishing off on wraparound childcare, there's one last question, which is about observations and start writing observations. Is that something you're particularly interested in that type of inspection, or any guidance there?
So I think we just go back there. So providers who provide that type of care before and after school, we make a met, not met judgment on inspection. And we don't, and that was a change when we introduced the education inspection framework. And that partly was because when we consulted about the education inspection framework and the fact that we were putting that focus on the importance of the substance of education, those providers who provide that type of care pointed out to us that actually they weren't sure that that judgment will work for them because they don't have to meet the learning and development requirements. And so therefore, in terms of observations and the assessment that are set out in part 2 of the EYFS, don't apply to providers who provide out of school care. So therefore, we wouldn't expect to see observations of children's learning on inspection. Not that we do on any other type of inspection anyway, but actually it's about, you know, still knowing about your children, and we're still interested to find out how you make sure those children are safe, happy and stimulated whilst they're with you after school. And it's complementing what happens where they get most of their EYFS curriculum.
Lovely. Okay, good. All right, we're going to move away from wraparound and talk about normal early years settings, early years settings, I meant to say. And one of the questions that we've been asked is, do you believe that settings should be given a reasonable amount of time from adapting to the new EYFS from September before an inspection happens? Okay, so shall I start with that one, Phil?
Yeah, go on.
Okay, so I think what's important there is, obviously we've said already that we inspect in line with the principles and requirements of the EYFS. Our inspections are back. We're doing that now. We will continue to do that in September. And as we know, the EYFS document is the DFE's, and they published that revised framework, and they've been continually you know, making the sector aware of their intentions. So the revised EYFS framework and the updated non-statutory guidance, curriculum guidance, development matters, that will come into place from the 1st of September is already on the Foundation Years website. It's already published out there. And we don't see that there be any issues with the transition and inspection. Our early years inspection handbook talks about what it is that we focus on our inspection, and that very much is finding out what it's like to be a child, and we will continue to do that from September.
Perfect, thank you. Phil, anything to add?
Well, just to think, I mean, you know, at the moment, though, those 7 areas of learning are all defined by the early years foundation stage. They're all in there, and the programs, the areas of learning are defined in there. In the revised one, there's more detail. So that's something that people might want to be looking at, and to see, you know, the extent to which that more detail makes a difference for them. But it's, you know, if in a way, from just purely looking at it from the terms of the curriculum, it's that more detail makes it a little bit easier to know what's being delivered, perhaps. And then if you think, you know, the development matters document, which is the DFE's guidance, it's non-statutory, so we won't be inspecting against it, but it has been produced for the DFE, and it is their sort of further breakdown, if you like, of all of that. That's also there to make it clearer, hopefully, for people.
Lovely. Okay, good. Thank you. And so we come to our last question. This has gone faster than any of our previous sessions. So I think, note to self, it's always easier when we questions in advance. But anyway, the last question then is really interesting. So it's an example. It's saying if a setting was inspected in the summer of 2021, so this summer, and their preparations, or shall we say lack of preparations for EYFS are either in progress, not in progress, is that something that Ofsted would take into account, or not really?
No, not really. Obviously, you know, for settings, you know, as Phil's just said, those documents are there and they can be used. And, you know, have a look at the changes to the educational programme, so that, you know, look at that extra detail there to see if that you know, is helping you in terms of your curriculum framework, as it were, because it provides that curriculum framework, the educational programs, and is useful there for you to reflect and think about what it is you're doing. But in terms of us and our inspections this term, we won't judge providers on their preparation for changes to the EYFS during our inspections this term. That's not something we'll be looking at.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Phil, anything to add?
Yeah, but I was just going to sort of take a step back, really. And I mean, I don't need to add anything to Wendy's just told you that we're not looking at that. But just thinking about what's in the EYFS and those areas of learning, we know that, you know, those are the statutory bits, aren't they? That the areas of learning in the EYFS are the things that all children are entitled to receive. And when we inspect against the requirements of the EYFS to make sure that children are getting all of that entitlement. But we know that for you, on a day-to-day basis, what's in the EYFS isn't sufficient to actually like know what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So we would always say that what's in the EYFS is the skeleton, and then you put the meat on the bones. You take those sort of those big overarching things that children are supposed to learn, and then you take it and sort of give it more detail, because you know your children, you know the sort of setting that you are, you know where you want them to get to, and you actually flesh out that guidance and turn it into something that you then can use on a sort of day-to-day, week-to-week basis, so that you know that your children are roughly where you want them to be. And I think it's, at this stage, it is worth looking at what you're currently doing, and then looking at the new stuff, and just beginning to see, is there a huge change here, or is this actually very much what we're doing already? And the same with the Development Matters document, which sort of, and that's where we see Development Matters fitting, is it's like someone has put that flesh on the bones for you already. That's one way of using that document. And like I said before, it's not statutory, so we won't inspect against it, but we do know that it's, you can't simply teach the EYFS from the document, because it's too sort of high level. Then, it's not manageable. So there's something that's got to happen in that middle space.
Great, thank you, Phil. One question has come in, and I don't think it's controversial, so I'm going to ask it anyway. But do you have any sense of how quickly new settings will be inspected at the moment, given the backlog with the pandemic? Any idea, new settings, somebody who's not been inspected before?
So one of the things where we're saying is we prioritise certain inspectors, providers in certain pots, as it were. That is one of the priorities, will be to inspect those providers who have yet to have their first inspection, and their inspections overdue. Because one of the things that our handbook does set out the frequency of inspection. Say for a provider's first inspection, we would usually inspect a provider within 30 months of their registration with us. But clearly we're behind on some of those inspections because the Secretary of State suspended routine inspection. So providers who are due a first inspection will be one of those providers in the pots of those that we're aimed to get to sooner rather than later. Lovely,
good. All right, thank you. So that's the end of the formal questions that we have been asked, or the ones that we summarised to be asked. We'll be wrapping up shortly, but obviously you've got immense experience, both of you, in this sector. Is there any other guidance or any other thoughts you'd like to share with our audience today that might be of value to them?
I think it's always, we sort of take every opportunity really to just talk, particularly when we're talking to early years providers, about what we actually do on inspection to find out how your curriculum is working. And your curriculum is basically what you want your children to learn. And when we launched this inspection framework, we talked about the sort of the anatomy of a curriculum, if you like, because we look at the curriculum, whether we're in an early years setting or in a school or in a further education place or a university, there's bits, because a curriculum is simply the sort of pathway that you've identified about how you're going to get the children you're working with from what they know at the moment to what you want them to know. So, they're sort of breaking it down into steps, like if you think, you want a child to learn to ride a bike, you start off by getting them to do balance, and then like steering, and then missing other people, and then you might go on to pedaling later on. So you break it down. And when we come in, what we're interested in first of all is what we call your intent, and that is what you want your children to learn, where you want them to get to by the time they leave you. What are the really big and important things that you want them to learn, that might be specific to your children, but they're also within the context of the curriculum, so those areas of learning set out by the EYFS. Then what we'll do is we'll look to see what's actually happening. So often that's with one of you, and we'll do some sort of joint observation where we're actually watching your curriculum in action and seeing how you're sort of delivering what you want children to learn. And then what we'll do is we'll look to see what children have really learned. So that's often when we're looking at an individual child, or we're talking to key workers or talking to parents about what their children can do now that they couldn't previously do. So often it sort of works like, we'll talk to you at the beginning of the day and we'll ask you about, say, communication and language. And you'll tell us that, that you want children to really like books. So you try and read lots of books with children, and you're always taking opportunities to get them to like books. You might be talking to them so that you're really developing their language. And, you might have one of those things where you always, take every opportunity to have a really good conversation with a child. Then what we'll do is we'll walk around with you and we'll be trying to see that happening. So we'll be looking for those opportunities, and you can point them out to us. Well, over there you might be, we've got that area over there where we've got the books, and we really always make sure we've got a member of staff in there who's always going to be engaging children with, that sort of thing. And then later on, when we're looking at an individual child and following them through, we'll look to see the extent to which they do like books, and how can we tell that? And if they've got favorite books, and then looking at their key worker and the key to see the extent to which the key worker can talk about, perhaps how their speech is coming on, and how what they understand and the way that they're using full sentences is moving on. It might be that you might have one of those, you might have a thing where in the baby room, you're always, as part of your language communication, you're always talking and singing with the babies and making eye contact when you're changing a nappy. So if that's something that you tell us you do, then when we're in that baby room, we'll look to see that happening. So it's can you see, it's sort of following it through. And then what we'll do towards the end of the inspection is we'll think through everything that we've seen, and then we'll talk to you about it to further understand how that's all working. Because sometimes what you want to happen all the time isn't happening all the time. But it's only, it's when we're on inspection and we'll see that. Or sometimes what we see is that what you're saying happens all the time. It really is happening all the time. It's having a really good effect. So
I'm sorry, go on.
No, go on.
I'll let you finish. I was just going to say, I had an example recently when I was visiting a nursery, and we were talking, I'd spoken to the manager, I was then speaking to the deputy manager, and we were in the 2 to 3 room and just talking about what it was that that setting wanted the 2 to 3 year olds to be able to do by the time they moved into the next room, into the preschool room, and talking about, what actually is it that you want your children to be learning in here. And I was being told that we want to make sure that children are able to put their own coats on, they're able to use the toilet independently, and some discussions around how that works and what you do when you're worried about someone, working in partnership with parents. And merrily, as we were having that conversation, so we were doing that thing, we were walking around and having those conversations, a little one runs in from the garden, takes off their coat, drops it on the floor, runs to the toilet. Next, an adult coming follows them in, and he's just like, don't forget to wash your hands when you finish, and out they come. And then they kind of do that thing with their coat where their coat's on the floor, they've put their arms in it, they flip it over, and they've got the coat on, and off they rush out to play. Well, actually, there was your evidence of learning right in front of us. Yeah. So that's the kind of, I hope that, that helps. That's what we're interested in when we're on inspection. What it is that you want your children to do, how you help them to do that, and how you've been successful. Are those children ready for what comes next in their lives?
And that's a really good example of how, when we're inspecting, it's not about the performance on the day, because that child couldn't have done that on that day only.
Not to order.
No, the only way they can do it is if actually that's what they do all the time. It's like saying please and thank you, isn't it? They won't do it just only on the day that you're there. If you don't expect them to say please and thank you every single time, then they won't learn that they do it automatically. And that's some of the learning that we're looking for. The other thing that when we talk about this, that we've also got to sort of identify is that sometimes it's easier to see things like that when we're looking at physical things. So, the ability to remember to flush, to use a potty properly, to put your coat on, to eat with a knife and fork. These physical things we can see and they're easier to observe. But we mustn't forget how important it is that we develop children's minds. So by giving them things to think about, things to be interested in, things to talk about, so we help them develop their vocabulary and they can talk about and describe a number of things, because that is so important. And it's one of the things that sometimes we see gets lost a bit because we focus on the things that we can see, and we can't see what's going on in a child's mind. So, and that need to help them be interested in things, ask questions about things, talk about things. That's really, really important, because the development of their vocabulary, all the time they're developing their vocabulary, they're developing more knowledge. And knowledge is really important, because knowledge is, knowledge isn't just a fact. It's not just a dusty fact. Knowledge is anything that you need to know to be able to understand or do something else. So, and it's really, really important. And when children know things, when they know about colors, and they know about dinosaurs, and they know about farm animals, and they know about emotions, and they know about speed, and they know, whatever it is they know about, that's what gives them a lot to think about and talk about. And also, when they then come across new things that they haven't met before, they've got all of this sort of knowledge that they can put it into, they can contextualize it. A child who knows about farm animals, when they come across I don't know, African animals, they're going to know stuff about those. So it's easier for them to know about animals, because they can add it to the knowledge they've already got. When children know about dinosaurs, they understand birds of prey a bit more, because they know dinosaurs are other animals, and birds of prey are the same. That's what really helps children, to have all this, these things that they know. And that comes from talking and describing things, and it also comes from books. A good, when it's fiction or non-fiction, that's another really important thing. There's nothing as great as sharing books with children, I think.
Perfect, thank you. I know Wendy needs to leave in a couple of minutes, so I think we'll start to wrap up. Wendy, Phil, thank you so much. That's been absolutely fascinating. Now, you can't see the messages that I can see, which are coming in. And let me tell you that the overwhelming word that keeps coming back after today's session is reassuring, or reassured. So I think if that's what everybody got from today, then I think that's a huge achievement. And we are immensely grateful to you both for your time today. So just to recap, that's been Wendy Ratcliffe, who's Ofsted's Principal Officer for Early Education, and Phil Minns, Specialist Advisor for Early Years and Primary. And once again, thank you to you both for giving us your time today. A reminder, everybody, that we'll send out the recording later on this afternoon, and we'll include a couple of items that Wendy and Phil have mentioned today. So it's the inspection book and the summary from the questionnaires that Ofsted has created. And a further reminder that on our weekly newsletter, anything that Ofsted publishes, we always reproduce on their behalf to send to you guys. On that note, we'll wrap it up for today. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear from Ofsted today. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Stay. Thank you. Goodbye.